I held my daughter's hand while she cried, convincing her to break up with the man she loved. I told her he was too primitive for our world. She had no idea that just hours before, while she slept upstairs, I was in the kitchen discovering exactly how primitive he could be. I didn't protect her heart, I cleared the path for my own sin. The evening settled over Manhattan like a heavy, velvet curtain, effectively muffling the chaotic symphony of the metropolis behind the thick, soundproof glass of our penthouse. From the 43rd floor, the city lights were nothing more than distant, glittering jewels, pretty to look at but too far away to touch. Inside the dining room, a carefully orchestrated atmosphere of domestic perfection reigned supreme. The savory scent of roasted veal and fresh rosemary drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the oaky, complex notes of the vintage French wine that had been breathing for exactly 45 minutes. Every element of the room was frozen in a state of magazine-ready stasis, from the gleaming silver cutlery arranged with geometric precision to the starched linen napkins that felt cool and stiff against the fingertips. Richard, my husband of 20 years, moved around the table with the jittery energy of a man preparing for a board meeting rather than a family dinner. He poured the wine into the crystal glasses with a pedantic exactitude, ensuring each level was perfectly equal, a small muscle twitching in his jaw. He was a man who found comfort in rules and structures, believing that if the surface remained flawless, the foundation would never crack. He straightened his tie for the third time in 10 minutes, muttering under his breath about the vital importance of first impressions and the necessity of maintaining standards. I watched him from the doorway, feeling a familiar wave of boredom wash over me, a dull, gray tide that had become the constant companion of my comfortable, predictable existence. We were waiting for our daughter, Emily, who was returning from college for the holidays, though she had warned us she was not coming alone. The anticipation in the room was thick enough to choke on, largely due to Richard's unvoiced anxieties about who, or what, our daughter might bring into our sanctuary. I leaned against the doorframe, swirling the wine in my glass, feeling less like a mother waiting for her child and more like a spectator waiting for the curtain to rise on a play I had already reviewed. My life felt like this room, beautiful, expensive, and hermetically sealed against anything real or raw. Then, the sharp, melodic chime of the doorbell sliced through the silence, signaling the end of our peace and the beginning of something I had not calculated. When the heavy oak door swung open, the air in the foyer seemed to instantly compress, as if the new arrival displaced more space than physics should allow. Emily entered first, beaming with a nervous excitement, but she was immediately overshadowed by the man following in her wake. Marcus was not merely tall, he was monumental, a towering presence that made the high ceilings of our apartment suddenly feel low. His dark skin absorbed the warm light of the chandelier, and his broad shoulders seemed to strain against the fabric of his jacket. He moved with a predatory grace, a calm assurance that stood in stark contrast to Richard's frantic, bird-like movements. He was the complete antithesis of the soft, pale men who populated our social circle. The introductions were a study in awkward contrasts, played out on the plush rug of the foyer. Richard extended his hand, his smile tight and practiced, but he looked fragile next to the sheer physicality of our guest. When Marcus gripped my husband's hand, I saw Richard flinch imperceptibly, dwarfed by the younger man's strength. Emily chattered nervously, trying to bridge the gap between her two worlds, but her voice sounded thin. I stood back, observing the tableau with a detached fascination. When Marcus turned his gaze to me, offering a polite greeting, I felt a jolt that had nothing to do with politeness. His eyes were intelligent and assessing, taking in the luxury, the tension, and me, with a directness that felt dangerously intimate. Dinner proceeded with the agonizing slowness of a deposition, governed by Richard's passive-aggressive hospitality. He wielded his politeness like a scalpel, asking questions that were designed to cut rather than connect. He inquired about Marcus's background, his family, and his financial prospects with the tone of a prosecutor, layering judgment beneath a veneer of concern. He spoke of cultural differences and the realities of the economy, using code words that we all understood but pretended not to hear. I sat in silence, picking at my food, fascinated by how effortlessly Marcus deflected these attacks. He did not apologize for who he was, nor did he rise to the bait. He simply smiled, a relaxed, knowing expression that seemed to infuriate Richard even more. I found myself ignoring the food on my plate, my appetite replaced by a different kind of hunger as I watched the guest across the table. I studied the way his hands moved, strong and sure, so different from Richard's manicured, soft fingers. There was a raw vitality to him, a suppressed power that vibrated beneath his calm exterior. Every time he took a sip of wine or cut his meat, I felt a strange tightening in my chest. He was an intruder in our sterile world, a splash of chaotic color on a gray canvas. I realized with a start that I wasn't looking at him as my daughter's boyfriend, but as a man, and the realization brought a flush of heat to my neck that I hoped the dim lighting concealed. The tension at the table reached a crescendo during the dessert course, the silence punctuated only by the scrape of silver against china. Marcus was speaking to Emily, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the wood of the table, when his hand brushed against his silverware, sending a heavy fork clattering to the floor between us. The noise was startlingly loud in the quiet room. Instinctively, we both moved at the same time to retrieve it. I dipped down, the silk of my dress rustling, just as he reached descending. Under the dark sanctuary of the tablecloth, hidden from Richard's critical eyes and Emily's innocent gaze, our hands met. It was an accident, a collision of fingers in the shadows, but neither of us pulled away immediately. His skin was dry and incredibly hot, radiating a feverish warmth that seemed to sear through my cool, pale hand. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, his fingers lingered over mine, a touch that was firm and deliberate. I looked up, breathless, and found his face inches from mine as we straightened up. He did not look apologetic. In his dark eyes, I saw no embarrassment, only a blatant, predatory challenge. It was a look that stripped away my social standing and my marital status, leaving me exposed. A shiver of pure, icy danger ran down my spine, shattering the suffocating comfort of the evening and waking something inside me that had been asleep for decades. Richard was in a state of fury that was all the more suffocating because of how quietly he wore it. In the sanctuary of our master suite, a room designed to be a temple of rest with its high thread count sheets and soundproofed walls, his anger vibrated like a low-frequency hum that set my teeth on edge. He did not shout or throw things, that would have been too raw, too human for a man who prided himself on his civilized restraint. Instead, he moved about the room with sharp, jerky motions, dismantling his appearance with aggressive precision. He unbuttoned his shirt as if he were dissecting a problem, placing his cufflinks into their velvet box with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I sat against the padded headboard, clutching a book I wasn't reading, watching him pace the plush carpet. He was ranting, but in that measured, lawyerly cadence he used when he wanted to demean someone without raising his voice. He spoke to the air, to the walls, to the reflection in the mirror, but every word was a calculated dart aimed at my composure. He climbed into bed, keeping a deliberate distance between us, pulling the duvet up to his chest as if shielding himself from contamination. He began to lecture me on the events of the evening, dissecting the dinner conversation with the cold logic of a surgeon performing an autopsy. He spoke of cultural incompatibilities and the statistical likelihood of failure in relationships that bridged such vast socioeconomic chasms. He was not talking about love or passion, he was talking about assets, reputation, and the seamless integration of bloodlines. He referred to Marcus not by name, but as, that young man, stripping him of his identity and reducing him to a problem to be solved. Richard's voice was monotonous and dry, a steady drip of cynicism that usually acted as a sedative to my own thoughts, lulling me into the compliant stupor of a good wife. Tonight, however, his words had the opposite effect. They scraped against my nerves like sandpaper, exposing the raw dissatisfaction festering beneath my skin. As he droned on about how Emily was making a catastrophic mistake by binding herself to someone so clearly outside our sphere, I found myself staring at the intricate plaster molding on the ceiling. Richard argued that Emily was blinded by infatuation, that she couldn't possibly understand the long-term ramifications of bringing someone like Marcus into our world. He listed the potential embarrassments at the country club, the awkwardness at gala dinners, the inevitable friction with his business partners. It was a masterclass in snobbery disguised as paternal concern. Yet, as I listened, I realized that his arguments were not just offensive, they were pitiful. They were the frantic defenses of a man who felt his territory threatened by a vitality he could neither understand nor replicate. His intellectual superiority was a fortress built on sand, and he knew it. He was trying to talk Marcus out of existence because the sheer physical reality of the man made Richard feel small. The monologue continued for what felt like an hour, a relentless stream of negativity that filled the dark room. I lay perfectly still, my breathing shallow, feeling a strange, foreign electricity crackling in my veins. It was a sensation I hadn't felt in years, perhaps decades, a humming restlessness that started in my chest and radiated outward to my fingertips and toes. It was the feeling of waking up. Richard's voice, usually the anchor of my reality, now seemed like the meaningless buzzing of a fly against a windowpane. I tried to focus on his words, to nod in the appropriate places, but my mind kept drifting back to the dining room. I kept replaying that moment under the table, the accidental collision of skin, the heat that had transferred from Marcus's hand to mine. That heat was still there, a phantom burn on my knuckles that Richard's icy logic could not extinguish. Finally, the lecture wound down, not because Richard had found peace, but because he had exhausted his vocabulary of complaints. He turned onto his side, presenting his back to me, a wall of flannel pajamas that signaled the end of the day's business. He adjusted his pillow with a final, irritated punch and exhaled sharply. "We will speak to her in the morning," he muttered into the darkness. "We have to be firm." Within minutes, his breathing shifted, deepening into the rhythmic, heavy drawl of deep sleep. He was gone, drifting into a world where everything was orderly and under his control, leaving me alone in the dark with a mind that refused to shut down. The silence that followed was absolute, amplified by the height of our apartment above the city streets, but inside my head, the noise was deafening. I lay there, eyes wide open, tracing the shadows cast by the streetlights filtering through the heavy drapes. The room, usually kept at a scientifically optimal temperature for sleep, suddenly felt stifling. The air was too still, too recycled, devoid of oxygen. I felt like a specimen preserved in a glass jar. A wave of heat washed over me, starting from the core of my stomach and flushing up to my face. It wasn't a hot flash, it was a surge of adrenaline, a physical manifestation of the electricity I had felt earlier. I was 40 years old, a woman of standing and grace, lying next to my successful husband in a multi-million-dollar penthouse, and I felt like a caged animal. The luxury that surrounded me, the silk sheets, the custom furniture, the smell of expensive lavender spray, it all felt like a shroud. I was suffocating under the weight of my own perfect life. I needed to move. I needed to break the stasis. The thought of lying there for another 6 hours, listening to the soft wheeze of Richard's breath, was physically painful. I needed air. Or water. Or just something that wasn't this room, this bed, this man. Slowly, with the practiced stealth of someone who has spent years avoiding intimacy, I slid my legs out from under the duvet. I sat on the edge of the mattress for a moment, listening. Richard didn't stir. He was a heavy sleeper, confident in the security of his fortress. I stood up, the carpet swallowing the sound of my bare feet, and reached for my robe draped over the chaotic pile of Richard's discarded clothes on the bench. It was a silk robe, a deep crimson color that Richard had bought me for our anniversary 3 years ago, a gift that was expensive, tasteful, and completely impersonal. I slipped my arms into the cool sleeves and cinched the belt tight around my waist, pulling the fabric closed like armor. The silk felt good against my heated skin, a slippery, cool contrast to the fever burning inside me. I walked to the door, easing it open just enough to slip through, and stepped out into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind me with a soft finality, sealing the sleeping husband away in his box. I was loose in the house. The penthouse at night was a different creature than it was during the day. In the sunlight, it was an architectural marvel of glass and steel, filled with light and views of the skyline. At night, it was a cavern of shadows and silence. The long corridor stretched out before me, lined with abstract expressionist paintings that looked like bruises in the dim light. The only illumination came from the recessed emergency lights near the floor and the blinking red eyes of the security system keypads. The house was armed, alarmed, and fortified against the outside world, breathing with a low, electronic hum. It felt less like a home and more like a high-end museum after closing hours, sterile and watching. I walked slowly down the hall, the floorboards silent beneath my feet. As I approached Emily's room, my steps faltered. The door was closed, but the heavy wood could not entirely block the sense of life behind it. I paused, holding my breath, and listened. I could hear nothing distinct, just the vague, heavy silence of people sleeping deep and soundly. But I knew they were in there. My daughter and the man who had disrupted our equilibrium. I imagined them tangled together in the sheets, young and unburdened by the years of compromises that weighed on me. For a second, a sharp pang of guilt pierced through my haze. I was a mother, standing in the dark, listening at her daughter's door while her husband slept. It was a grotesque image. But the guilt was fleeting, brittle as dry ice. It evaporated almost as soon as it arrived, burned away by the rising tide of excitement that was propelling me forward. The mother part of me whispered that I should go back to bed, that I should be shocked by their proximity, that I should be worrying about Emily's virtue. But the woman in the crimson robe didn't care about virtue. She cared about the fact that there was a raw, masculine energy in this house that hadn't been here yesterday. The thought of Marcus, sleeping just a few feet away, strong and unapologetic in his difference, made my pulse hammer in my throat. I wasn't checking on them. I was feeding off their proximity. I pushed away from Emily's door, shaking off the remnant of maternal conscience, and continued down the corridor. The hallway opened up into the grand living area, a vast space with two-story windows that looked out over the glittering expanse of Manhattan. The city was asleep, or as asleep as it ever got, a sprawling grid of amber and white light stretching to the horizon. I usually loved this view. It made me feel powerful, elevated above the grime and the noise. Tonight, it just looked distant. I felt a desperate need to be grounded, to feel something real. I moved towards the floating staircase that led down to the lower level of the duplex, running my hand along the cold steel railing. The metal bit into my palm, grounding me. As I descended the stairs, the shadows shifted around me. The lower level was a landscape of dark shapes, the grand piano, the oversized sofas, the sculptures, all silent witnesses to my insomnia. I reached the bottom landing and turned towards the kitchen, intending to get a glass of ice water to cool the fire in my chest. The kitchen was usually the heart of the home, but at night, it was just another sleek, dark room full of stainless steel appliances. I expected total darkness. I expected to be the only living soul awake in this glass tower. But as I rounded the corner of the dining area, I stopped dead. A sliver of light was slicing across the polished limestone floor. It was coming from the kitchen, a single beam cutting through the gloom. The refrigerator door was open. Someone was there. My heart skipped a beat, a physical thud against my ribs that was loud in my ears. Logic told me it was Emily, getting a midnight snack. Or perhaps Richard had woken up and come down ahead of me, though that was unlikely given his sleeping pills. But deep down, in the primitive part of my brain that had been vibrating all night, I knew who it was. I should have called out. I should have announced my presence, turned on a light, retreated upstairs to the safety of my marital bed. That would have been the correct, civilized response. But I didn't. I stood frozen in the shadows, watching that strip of light. The fear that fluttered in my stomach was not the fear of an intruder, it was the fear of a gambler placing a bet they couldn't afford to lose. It was a thrill. The air around me seemed to thicken, charged with the same tension that had been under the dinner table. My feet moved before my mind gave the command. They carried me forward, out of the safety of the dark living room and towards the light, drawn inevitably towards the unknown variable that was waiting for me in the kitchen. The source of the light was the open refrigerator, a vertical coffin of artificial brightness that cut through the gloom of the kitchen. Marcus stood bathed in its cold, halogen glow, a silhouette carved out of the darkness. He was facing away from me at first, the door of the appliance acting as a shield, but as I stepped onto the cool limestone tiles, he turned. In his hand, he held a chilled bottle of water, condensation already weeping down the plastic sides. He was wearing a simple white t-shirt that looked like it had been bought in a pack of 3, yet on him, it looked like a custom garment. The cotton strained against the width of his back and the thick ropes of muscle in his arms. In the harsh light of the fridge, he appeared even larger than he had at dinner, a monolith of physical reality in a house built on illusions. He didn't jump. He didn't fumble the bottle or look guilty like a child caught stealing sweets. He simply turned his head, his movements fluid and deliberate, and locked eyes with me. There was zero surprise in his gaze, as if he had been waiting for me to walk out of the shadows all along. I stopped in the doorway, using the architrave as a frame to compose myself. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, gripping the silk of my elbows, consciously adopting the posture of the matriarch, the guardian of the gate. I needed to feel superior, because standing there in my nightclothes, looking at his bare arms and the calm set of his jaw, I felt dangerously exposed. I took a breath, inhaling the sterile scent of the kitchen mixed with the faint, warm musk of his presence, and steeled myself. I was here to protect my daughter. That was the script. That was the narrative I was clinging to with white knuckles. I lowered my chin, narrowing my eyes in a simulation of maternal disapproval, and stepped into the room. The hum of the refrigerator compressor was the only sound, a low, rhythmic throb that seemed to synchronize with the beating of my heart. I decided to strike first, to use words as a weapon before the silence could suffocate me. "I know exactly what you are doing," I whispered, my voice a hiss of escaping steam. I kept it low, ostensibly to avoid waking Richard or Emily upstairs, but also because the intimacy of a whisper felt more dangerous, more potent. I walked towards him, my bare feet silent on the floor. "You think because she is young and naive, you can just walk in here and dazzle her. You think you can charm your way into this life." I gestured vaguely at the high-end appliances, the marble countertops, the trappings of wealth that surrounded us. "But I see you, Marcus. I see right through the polite smiles and the quiet act. You are a tourist here. You are looking for a meal ticket, or a trophy, or maybe just a story to tell your friends back in the neighborhood. But you are not here for Emily. Not really." Marcus didn't interrupt. He unscrewed the cap of his water bottle with a slow, deliberate twist of his wrist, the plastic cracking sharply in the quiet room. He took a long, slow drink, his throat working as he swallowed, his eyes never leaving mine over the tilted rim of the bottle. It was infuriating. I expected him to defend himself, to stutter apologies, to look at his feet in shame. Instead, he watched me with a dark, glittering amusement, as if I were performing a monologue he found mildly entertaining. His silence forced me to keep talking, to fill the void with more venom. I took another step closer, encroaching on his personal space, testing his boundaries. "She is going to wake up one day and realize you have nothing in common," I continued, injecting as much ice into my tone as I could muster. "And when she does, she will be heartbroken. It is my job to prevent that. It is my job to make sure she doesn't throw her future away on a mistake." I was projecting. Every word I spoke was a borrowed line from Richard's earlier lecture, repurposed and sharpened. I was channeling my husband's snobbery, using it as a shield to hide the trembling in my own knees. But as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. I looked at Marcus, at the smooth, dark skin of his neck, the heavy brow, the confident set of his mouth, and I knew I was lying. I wasn't worried about Emily's future. I wasn't thinking about her tuition or her social standing. I was thinking about the way he occupied space. I was thinking about the raw, undeniable gravity he generated. I was goading him, pushing him, not to drive him away, but to see if he would push back. I wanted to know if the strength I sensed at dinner was real, or if he would crumble under the weight of my social authority like every other man I knew. I moved closer still, until I was only a few feet away. I could feel the radiant heat of his body now, a physical warmth that clashed with the cool air spilling from the open fridge. "You should leave," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming huskier. "You should pack your bag in the morning and go back to wherever you came from before you embarrass yourself. You don't belong in this world, Marcus. You are out of your depth." I was cornering him against the counter, physically trapping him. It was an aggressive, dominant move, one that should have made him uncomfortable. I wanted to provoke a reaction. I wanted anger. I wanted him to snap at me, to raise his voice, to give me a reason to scream, to release the tension that was coiling inside me like a tightly wound spring. But Marcus didn't flinch. He lowered the water bottle slowly, setting it on the marble counter behind him without looking away from me. He leaned back slightly, resting his hips against the edge of the sink, crossing his ankles. His posture remained relaxed, open, utterly devoid of defensiveness. The corners of his mouth twitched upwards, not in a smile of submission, but in a smirk of recognition. It was the look of a predator who realizes the prey is not running, but presenting itself. In the reflected light, his eyes danced with those merry, dangerous sparks I had seen earlier. He looked at me not as his girlfriend's mother, but as a woman who was standing too close, breathing too fast, and protesting too much. The air between us grew thick, heavy with unsaid things, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You have a lot to say about what I want," Marcus said finally. His voice was a deep rumble, a baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards beneath my feet. It was calm, devoid of anger, laced with a terrifyingly perceptive curiosity. "You have got me all figured out, haven't you? The gold digger. The charity case." He took a half step forward, closing the remaining distance between us, turning the tables so subtly that I barely registered the shift in power. "But tell me something, Mrs. Sterling." He used my married name with a deliberate, mocking formality. "Are you really this worried about Emily's heart? Is that what is keeping you up at 2 in the morning? Or is there something else bothering you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sticky like humid air before a storm. It stripped away my defenses in a single stroke. He knew. He saw the frantic energy beneath my cold exterior, the hunger disguised as concern. He was calling my bluff. I felt a flush of heat rise up my neck, burning my cheeks. How dare he? How dare he look at me with that knowing arrogance in my own kitchen? The indignation flared bright and hot, a sudden surge of adrenaline that demanded a physical release. My hand twitched at my side. I wanted to wipe that smirk off his face. I wanted to assert my dominance, to remind him of his place, to punish him for seeing the truth I was hiding even from myself. I raised my hand, my palm open, intending to slap him. The motion was sharp, violent, born of panic and desire in equal measure. I aimed for his cheek, wanting the stinging sound of flesh on flesh to break the spell. But as my arm moved through the air, something shifted. The anger didn't dissipate, but it transformed, liquefying into something heavier, darker. My hand didn't strike his face. It faltered in midair, losing its velocity, and drifted downward. It was a betrayal of my own body. Instead of a blow, my palm landed squarely on his upper arm, my fingers curling around the bicep. The contact was electric. Through the thin white cotton of his t-shirt, I felt the muscle beneath. It was rock hard, tense, and warm. It didn't yield under my touch, it pushed back. The muscles bunched instantly, tightening like steel cables under my grip. It was a shocking display of latent power, a physical reality that made Richard's soft, gym-sculpted body seem like dough in comparison. I froze, my hand clutching his arm, my breath catching in my throat. I should have pulled away. I should have been horrified. But I wasn't. I was anchored there, feeling the pulse of his blood beneath my fingertips, staring up into eyes that were no longer mocking, but dark with an intent that matched my own. The silence in the kitchen was no longer empty, it was screaming. What happened next had absolutely nothing to do with romance, and certainly nothing to do with the tender, cinematic idea of love. It was not a meeting of hearts or a soft entanglement of souls, it was a collision of two volatile elements that had been kept under too much pressure for too long. When Marcus moved, the shift was tectonic. He didn't ask for permission, and he didn't offer an apology. He simply closed the distance between us, his hand coming up to wrap around the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair with a grip that was possessive and unyielding. In that split second, before our bodies even fully met, every single one of my carefully constructed justifications, the maternal duty, the protective instinct, the moral high ground, disintegrated into dust. They were blown away like ash in a gale, revealing the naked, starving truth underneath. I wasn't there to save Emily. I was there because I wanted to be consumed. The moment he pulled me against him, the air left my lungs in a sharp, shocked gasp that was swallowed by his mouth. This was not the polite, tentative affection I had known for the last 2 decades. It was an assault on the senses, a raw, unadulterated intake of breath and skin and heat. Standing there in the sterile light of my designer kitchen, with the refrigerator compressor humming its monotonous tune beside us, I was suddenly jolted awake. It was as if I had been sleepwalking through a grayscale life, and suddenly, violently, everything had burst into blinding technicolor. The contrast was so sharp it was physically painful. I had spent 20 years in a marriage that was safe, predictable, and utterly devoid of friction. Richard was a man of the mind, an intellectual who treated intimacy like a scheduled transaction, something to be performed with efficiency and hygiene, usually on Saturday nights after the news. With Richard, every touch was calculated, every kiss a polite inquiry. His lovemaking was like his conversation about the stock market, structured, risk-averse, and ultimately boring. He touched me as if I were a rare porcelain vase that he was afraid to break, or perhaps, afraid to smudge. There was no danger in his bed, only the soft, suffocating comfort of familiarity. But here, pressed up against the cold marble of the kitchen island by a man young enough to be my son, there was only fire. Marcus didn't treat me like porcelain. He treated me like something that could take a hit, something that could match his force. There was a primitive power in him, a hunger that didn't ask questions or wait for permission. He moved with a heavy, deliberate confidence, his hands mapping my body not with reverence, but with a claim of ownership that I should have found repulsing, yet found utterly intoxicating. I justified it to myself in real time, my mind racing even as my body surrendered. I told myself this was just an experiment, a momentary lapse in judgment induced by insomnia and stress. I told myself I was just testing the boundaries, seeing how far he would go, that I could stop this at any moment. It was a lie. I was powerless to stop it, because for the first time in years, I wasn't just a wife or a mother or a socialite. I was a physical being. I was flesh and blood and nerve endings, all firing at once. The sensation of his rough hands against the silk of my robe, the hardness of his chest crushing my breasts, the taste of him, it was an overdose of sensation. I felt like a drowning woman who had suddenly been given a lungful of pure oxygen, and the rush was making me dizzy. We moved in a blur of urgency, a silent tussle of limbs and mouths. He lifted me effortlessly, sitting me onto the edge of the counter, his actions fluid and powerful. The cold stone bit into my thighs, a sharp contrast to the furnace heat radiating from him, and the shock of it made me arch my back. I wrapped my legs around him instinctively, pulling him closer, erasing the last few inches of space between us. Every touch was electric, a jolt that started at the point of contact and sizzled down my spine. It was rough, clumsy in its haste, and devoid of any gentleness. He kissed me like he was trying to devour me, and I kissed him back with a desperation that had been gathering dust in the corners of my soul for half a lifetime. I bit his lip, he gripped my waist until I knew there would be bruises in the morning. The danger of the situation acted like an accelerant, pouring gasoline on an already raging fire. We were directly beneath the bedrooms. 1 floor up, through a layer of drywall and timber, my husband was sleeping the sleep of the righteous, and my daughter was dreaming of the man who was currently burying his face in my neck. The sheer proximity of exposure was terrifying. Every creak of the house settling, every hum of the dishwasher, every shift of weight on the floorboard sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night. I knew that if the door opened, if Richard came down for water, if Emily woke up, my life as I knew it would be over. The scandal would be absolute, a nuclear detonation that would incinerate my reputation, my family, and my future. But instead of making me stop, the risk only made the pleasure sharper. The fear was a spice, sharp and metallic, mixing with the lust to create a cocktail that made my head spin. We were balancing on a razor's edge, dancing on the rim of a volcano, and the vertigo was exquisite. I found myself listening for footsteps on the stairs not with dread, but with a twisted kind of anticipation. It felt like we were stealing something, reclaiming a primal right that civilization had tried to breed out of us. In that kitchen, surrounded by the trappings of civilized wealth, the espresso machine, the imported tiles, the crystal glasses. We were animals. We were stripped of our names and our titles, reduced to the basic biological imperatives of heat and friction. I looked into his eyes in the moments when we broke apart for air, expecting to see triumph or mockery. I expected to see the gotcha look of a man who has successfully seduced the older, wealthy woman. But I didn't. In the dim light, his eyes were black pools of focus. He wasn't thinking about my money or my daughter. He was focused entirely on the sensation of the moment, on the physical reality of me. And in those eyes, I saw a reflection that terrified me. I saw myself. Not the Mrs. Sterling who chaired charity galas and hosted dinner parties, but the woman beneath the skin. I saw my own hunger mirrored back at me, my own suppressed need for dominance and submission, my own craving for a touch that was heavy enough to ground me. He wasn't just a boy, and he wasn't just a mistake. He was a catalyst. He was the physical manifestation of everything I had denied myself for 20 years. I had spent my life being good, being proper, being the perfect accessory to Richard's perfect life. I had starved myself of passion in exchange for security. And now, this stranger, this primitive outsider as Richard called him, had walked into my kitchen and broken the lock on the cage. He was giving me exactly what I hadn't known I needed. He was making me feel small, not intellectually, but physically. He was overwhelming me, taking the burden of control away from me. For a woman who had to manage everything, the house, the image, the emotions of her family, the freedom of being overwhelmed was euphoric. We didn't speak. Words would have broken the spell, would have reintroduced logic and morality into a space where they didn't belong. The only sounds were the ragged tearing of breath, the friction of fabric, and the soft, wet sounds of our mouths. I ran my hands over the muscles of his back, feeling the tension and the power coiling there, marveling at the difference between this hard, unyielding body and the soft, doughy comfort of my husband. This was what I had been missing. This raw, kinetic energy. This was life. It was dirty, it was dangerous, it was completely wrong, and it was the most vital I had felt since I was 20 years old. As the encounter reached its peak, a fever pitch of sensation that blotted out the room, the city, and the world, I felt a profound sense of dislocation. I was watching myself from the ceiling, seeing a woman in a silk robe tangled with a young man on a kitchen counter, and I didn't recognize her. She was wild. She was greedy. She was taking what she wanted without a single thought for the consequences. And as the waves of pleasure crashed over me, shattering the last of my resistance, the most terrifying realization wasn't that I was betraying my husband. It wasn't that I was betraying my daughter, sleeping with the boy she thought she loved. The horror, the true, cold horror of the moment, was that I didn't care. I felt absolutely no guilt. As I dug my nails into his shoulders, anchoring myself against the storm, I searched my conscience for a shred of remorse, for a pang of shame. I found nothing. All I found was a pulsing, radiant euphoria, a sense of victory. I was stealing a moment of life back from the jaws of a dead existence. I was drinking from a well I was told was poisoned, and it tasted like sweet, cold water. In the silence that followed, as we pulled apart, breathless and disheveled, standing in the wreckage of our propriety, I looked at him and knew that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And God help me, I was glad. The morning sun did not rise gently. It assaulted the penthouse with a blinding, merciless clarity that felt like an interrogation. The floor-to-ceiling windows, which had been portals to a mysterious, glittering world the night before, now admitted a flood of harsh white light that exposed every dust mote and every flaw. It was the kind of aggressive brightness that demanded transparency, yet I sat at the breakfast table wrapped in layers of deceit so thick they felt like physical armor. I had showered and scrubbed my skin until it was pink, trying to wash away the scent of musk and betrayal, but the phantom sensation of Marcus's hand still lingered on my waist like a brand. I wore a crisp, high-collared blouse and pearl earrings, the very picture of the virtuous matriarch, sipping my Earl Grey tea with a steady hand that belied the chaotic thrumming of my pulse. I was performing the role of my life, a masterclass in duplicity, while the memory of the kitchen counter played on a loop in the back of my mind. Richard sat at the head of the table, hidden behind the expansive pages of the Wall Street Journal, a fortress of newsprint that protected him from the need to interact with his family. He was the picture of oblivious contentment, humming softly as he read about market fluctuations, completely unaware that the structural integrity of his marriage had been demolished a few hours prior. He looked so safe, so predictable, so utterly devoid of the raw, dangerous energy that had consumed me in the dark. I looked at his manicured hands holding the paper and felt a wave of revulsion so strong it tasted like bile. It wasn't just that he was boring, it was that his entire existence felt like a suffocation I had only just realized I was enduring. He was the cage, and I had finally found the key, even if using it meant burning down the house. Marcus sat opposite me, nursing a black coffee. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes dark against his skin, but there was a relaxed tension in his shoulders that I recognized instantly. He was avoiding my gaze with a disciplined effort, focusing on the skyline or his plate, but the air between us was charged with a static electricity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. Every time he moved, every time he lifted his cup, I felt a sympathetic twitch in my own muscles. We were conspirators in plain sight, two people sharing a secret language of silence while the world carried on around us. I watched him butter his toast, remembering the strength of those fingers, and had to look away, focusing on the floral centerpiece to keep the flush from rising to my cheeks. He was playing his part perfectly, but the corner of his mouth held the ghost of a smirk. Emily was the only source of genuine noise in the room, her chatter filling the silence like bird song. She was glowing with the naive optimism of youth, talking about her plans to take Marcus to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and then for a walk in Central Park. She reached out and touched his arm affectionately, a gesture of ownership that sent a sharp, irrational spike of jealousy through my chest. It was absurd, she was my daughter, and he was her boyfriend, but the beast that had awoken inside me didn't care about bloodlines or propriety. I smiled at her, a tight, indulgent smile, while my mind began to sharpen the knives I would need for the work ahead. I couldn't let them go to the museum. I couldn't let them play house. The game had changed, and I needed to clear the board. I waited until breakfast was cleared and Richard had retreated to his study to make important calls, a ritual that usually involved napping with the door locked. Marcus excused himself to get ready, leaving me alone with Emily. I seized the moment with the precision of a predator, suggesting we take our tea in the winter garden. It was a glass-enclosed solarium on the east side of the apartment, filled with exotic orchids and ferns, a humid, silent space that felt separate from the rest of the world. It was my favorite place to corner people, because the heavy, damp air made everything feel intimate and inevitable. I guided her there, my hand resting gently on her back, guiding the lamb to the slaughter with a touch that was meant to be comforting. We sat on the wicker furniture, surrounded by the lush greenery that thrived in the artificial climate. I poured her a fresh cup of tea, watching the steam rise, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make her nervous. When I finally spoke, I pitched my voice low, filling it with a lifetime of simulated maternal concern. I took her hands in mine, feeling how small and soft they were, and looked her in the eye. I told her that I loved her more than anything in the world, and that because I loved her, I had to be honest about things she couldn't see. I told her that I had been watching Marcus, really watching him, and that I was worried. It was the perfect opening gambit, vague enough to induce anxiety, specific enough to sound authoritative. I began to dismantle her relationship with surgical precision, using the very arguments Richard had bludgeoned us with the night before, but wrapping them in the soft velvet of female wisdom. I didn't speak of money or status directly, instead, I spoke of compatibility and emotional language. I told her that Marcus was a man of a different world, not a worse world, I hastened to add, lying through my teeth, but a harder one. I used the word primitive to describe his energy, twisting the meaning to sound like a warning about his emotional capacity. I told her that men like him, men with that kind of raw, physical presence, eventually get bored with girls like her. I painted her as delicate, refined, a flower that would be crushed by his rougher nature. I made her refinement sound like a weakness, and his strength like a threat. He doesn't understand you, darling, I whispered, squeezing her hands. He is fascinated by this life, by the luxury, by the novelty of you. But that isn't love. It's tourism. I saw the doubt flicker in her eyes, the way her lip trembled. I pressed harder. I told her that I had seen the way he looked at other women, the way he seemed restless in our home. I projected my own restlessness onto him, weaving a narrative where he was the one pulling away, where he was the one secretly judging us. I told her that he was likely already looking for someone simpler, someone who didn't require so much effort to understand, someone from his own background who spoke his language without needing a translator. I planted the seed that he was staying out of politeness, or perhaps pity, and that the kindest thing she could do was set him free. Emily tried to argue at first, her voice wavering as she defended his character. She spoke of his kindness, his ambition, the way he made her laugh. But I was relentless. I countered every point with a sad, knowing smile, the kind that says, "You are young, you don't understand how the world works." I weaponized her own insecurities against her. I knew she always felt a little out of place, a little too soft for the real world, and I confirmed her worst fears. I told her that she deserved someone who cherished her fragility, not someone who would eventually resent it. I was gaslighting my own child, dismantling her happiness brick by brick, and justifying it with the twisted logic that I was saving her from a heartbreak that I was actually orchestrating. By the time I was finished, she wasn't crying because she was angry, she was crying because she believed me. The tears came in a torrent, hot and heavy, staining her cheeks. She collapsed into my arms, burying her face in my shoulder, sobbing that she didn't want to lose him but she didn't want to be a burden. I stroked her hair, making soothing shushing noises, playing the role of the comforter while my heart beat with a cold, triumphant rhythm. I felt a strange dissociation, looking down at her shaking form. Part of me, the part that was still Mrs. Sterling, the good mother, was horrified. But the other part, the woman who had clawed her way out of the dark last night, felt only a grim satisfaction. I was hurting her to save myself. I was breaking her heart to clear the path for my own desires. It was selfish, it was monstrous, and it was necessary. I held her until the sobbing subsided into hiccups, until she looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and nodded. She would do it. She would end it. By lunchtime, the atmosphere in the penthouse was thick enough to choke on. The bright sun had moved overhead, casting short, sharp shadows. We gathered in the dining room for a light meal that no one wanted. Richard was back, cheerful and oblivious, talking about a merger he was overseeing. Marcus was quiet, sensing the shift in the air, his eyes darting between Emily and me. I sat perfectly still, picking at a salad, waiting for the inevitable. Emily didn't eat. She drank 2 glasses of water, her hands trembling, before she finally put her napkin on the table and turned to Marcus. Her voice was thin and brittle, like dry leaves, as she told him that she didn't think this was working out. She recited the lines I had fed her, stumbling over the words about different paths and needing space. It was a painful, awkward spectacle. Emily was crying again, the tears silent this time, sliding down her face. Marcus looked stunned. He put his fork down slowly, looking from Emily to Richard, and finally to me. For a moment, he looked like he was going to argue, to fight for her. He opened his mouth, his brow furrowing in confusion. But then his eyes locked with mine across the table. I held his gaze, my expression unreadable, icy and calm. I didn't blink. In that silent exchange, 1,000 words were spoken. I saw the realization dawn on him. He saw the cold calculation in my eyes, the lack of surprise. He understood instantly that this wasn't Emily speaking. He understood that I had done this. And he didn't fight. He didn't expose me. He simply closed his mouth, a muscle feathering in his jaw. He looked at Emily with a strange mix of pity and resignation, and nodded. "If that's what you want, Em," he said softly. His voice was devoid of the aggression Richard always attributed to him. It was dignified. Richard, for his part, could barely conceal his glee. He cleared his throat, trying to look sympathetic but failing miserably. He offered to call a car for Marcus immediately, eager to physically remove the problem from his sanctuary. He patted Emily on the hand in a way that was meant to be comforting but looked more like a congratulatory gesture. He thought his logic had won the day. He thought his lecture the night before had penetrated Emily's mind. The arrogance of the man was staggering. The departure was swift and brutal. Marcus packed his bag in 10 minutes. I stood by the window in the living room, watching the street below, while Richard ushered him out the door like a bouncer at a club. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. As the heavy front door clicked shut, sealing the apartment once again in its hermetic silence, I felt a release of tension that left me lightheaded. I watched from 43 stories up as the yellow cab pulled up to the curb. A minute later, a small figure with a bag emerged from the building and got into the back seat. The car merged into the river of traffic, a yellow drop in a sea of gray, carrying him away from my daughter, but not away from me. I turned back to the room. Emily was in her bedroom, likely sobbing into her pillow. Richard was pouring himself a celebratory scotch, muttering about how it was all for the best and how she'll thank us later. I walked over to the mirror in the hallway and checked my reflection. I looked exactly the same as I had that morning: perfect hair, perfect pearls, perfect wife. But behind the eyes, there was something new. A hardness. A hunger that had been fed but not sated. I had cleared the board. I had sacrificed my daughter's happiness to remove the social obstacle between Marcus and myself. I had played a dangerous, cruel game, and I had won. There was no guilt, only a cold, calculating assessment of the next move. He was gone from the apartment, which meant he was no longer under Richard's roof, no longer subject to the rules of this house. He was out there in the city, angry, confused, and free. And I had the means to reach him. I had the money, I had the freedom of my days, and now, I had the motivation. I touched the spot on my arm where he had grabbed me the night before, feeling the ghost of the bruise forming there. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of the prologue. The real story, the one that would take place in motel rooms and shadowed corners, the one paid for with tuition checks and silence, was just beginning. And as I listened to Richard toast to family values, I smiled, and the satisfaction tasted sweeter than the wine. 3 months had passed since the day I watched the yellow taxi disappear into the canyon of Manhattan streets, carrying Marcus away from my daughter and into the waiting arms of my own design. The seasons had turned with their usual indifference, dragging the city from the humid, sticky heat of late summer into the gray, weeping embrace of November. Outside, an unrelenting autumn rain was drumming a rhythmic, melancholy tattoo against the thin glass of the motel window, blurring the world into a smudge of charcoal and slate. We were on the outskirts of the city, in a borough where the skyline was low and industrial, a place where people of my social circle would never venture unless they were lost or hiding. The neon sign outside flickered with a dying buzz, casting an intermittent, sickly red glow across the peeling laminate of the furniture. It was a cheap motel, the kind that rented rooms by the hour to truck drivers and desperate lovers, and it smelled faintly of stale tobacco smoke, industrial cleaner, and secrets. To anyone else, this room would have been a depressing hole, a symbol of hitting rock bottom. The wallpaper was fading, curling at the seams like dead skin, and the carpet was a suspicious shade of brown that hid a multitude of sins. But to me, sitting on the edge of the sagging mattress, it was a sanctuary. It was the only place in the world where the air didn't feel thin. In the penthouse, surrounded by imported art and Richard's suffocating expectations, I felt like a specimen pinned under glass. Here, amidst the grime and the anonymity, I felt strangely purified. The squalor was honest. There were no pretenses here, no dinner parties where we smiled while stabbing each other with polite words. Here, the transaction was raw and visible, stripping us down to our most basic, animalistic components. I ran my hand over the rough, cheap bedspread, feeling the friction against my palm, grounding myself in the gritty reality of my double life. I turned to the mirror above the dresser, checking my reflection in the cloudy glass that was etched with the ghosts of 1,000 other faces. The woman looking back at me was still Mrs. Sterling. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup was flawless, and the diamond studs in her ears caught the dim light with a cold, hard fire. But the eyes were different. They were darker, harder, devoid of the nervous flutter that used to plague me. I adjusted a stray lock of hair, tucking it behind my ear with a steady hand. I looked like a woman who was waiting for a business partner, or perhaps a hitman. In a way, I suppose I was waiting for both. I had become an expert at compartmentalization, slicing my life into neat, hermetically sealed boxes. There was the box for Richard, filled with charity galas and silence. There was the box for Emily, filled with lies and maternal pantomime. And then there was this box, this room, filled with a hunger that refused to be satiated. The sound of the bathroom door opening cut through the sound of the rain. A cloud of warm, damp steam rolled out into the chilly room, carrying the scent of soap and wet skin. Marcus stepped out, a white towel draped loosely around his hips, another in his hand as he vigorously rubbed his hair. He didn't look at me immediately. He was comfortable enough now to take his time. The 3 months had changed him, too, or perhaps they had just revealed more of what was already there. He seemed bigger in this small room, his presence filling the space until there was no air left for anything else. The hesitation and the subtle deference he had shown during that first dinner were long gone, replaced by an arrogant, easy familiarity. He walked across the room with the careless grace of a large cat, his bare feet silent on the worn carpet, water droplets gleaming on his dark skin like oil. He tossed the towel onto the lone armchair in the corner and turned to face me. There were no sweet greetings, no tender inquiries about my day. We had bypassed the need for romantic preludes weeks ago. Our relationship had been forged in the fire of deception, and it operated on a fuel of cynicism that burned hotter than affection ever could. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest, and looked at me with that heavy, lidded gaze that always made my breath hitch. He knew exactly who I was. He knew I wasn't the benevolent patron or the grieving mother. He knew I was a woman who would burn down her own house to feel the heat. And I knew him. I knew that beneath the stoic exterior lay a calculating mind that had assessed the situation and realized that sleeping with the mother was a much more lucrative path than dating the daughter. I reached into my designer handbag, the leather feeling cool and smooth under my fingers, and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was heavy, weighted with potential. I placed it on the scarred nightstand with a soft thud that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Inside was cash, untraceable, clean, and substantial. It was enough to cover the tuition for his next semester at the university, plus a generous stipend for living expenses. This was the arrangement. I paid for his future, ensuring he remained the successful, educated man that Richard claimed he could never be, and in return, he gave me his present. It was a scholarship of the flesh, funded by my husband's estate and my own moral bankruptcy. The irony that I was now financing the very ambition I had mocked to Emily was a private joke I savored. Marcus looked at the envelope, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, he pushed off the wall and walked over to the nightstand. He picked up the envelope, weighing it in his hand as if judging the quality of a cut of meat. He didn't open it, he didn't need to. He trusted my payment as much as I trusted his silence. A slow smile spread across his face, that same dangerous, knowing smile that had terrified me at the dinner table 3 months ago. Back then, it had felt like a threat. Now, it felt like a signature. It was an acknowledgement of our conspiracy, a silent agreement that we were both monsters playing a game the rest of the world was too stupid to understand. He looked at me, and his eyes crinkled at the corners, not with warmth, but with the amusement of a man who has just won a rigged bet. "You are generous today, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. He still used my married name sometimes, usually when money was changing hands. It was a part of the game, a way of emphasizing the transgression. It reminded us both of the boundaries we were violating. He tossed the envelope back onto the table, where it landed next to the Gideon Bible that neither of us had ever opened. He wasn't ashamed of taking the money. Why should he be? I had taught him that everything in my world had a price tag. I had taught him that loyalty was fluid and that survival was the only virtue that mattered. In a way, I was the best teacher he had ever had. I was teaching him the brutal physics of the upper class: take what you can, and never apologize. Just as the atmosphere in the room began to shift, thickening with the familiar tension that preceded our physical interactions, a sound shattered the mood. My cell phone, which I had left face up on the bedspread, began to buzz violently. The screen lit up, casting a harsh, blue-white light that cut through the dim, red-tinged gloom of the motel room. A photograph filled the display, a selfie of Emily, smiling, her face framed by sunlight, taken before I had destroyed her happiness. The name Emily flashed insistently beneath the photo. The buzzing sound was like an alarm, a frantic, mechanical scream from the life I had left behind an hour ago. It was a lifeline thrown from the wreckage, demanding to be caught. I stared at the phone, my heart giving a single, hard thump against my ribs. I knew exactly why she was calling. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and she had no classes. She was likely sitting in her dorm room, or perhaps in the winter garden at home, staring at the rain and thinking about him. She was still suffering. She was still mourning the relationship I had forced her to end, convinced that she was the one who had failed. She was calling her mother for comfort. She wanted to hear my voice, to hear me tell her again that she had done the right thing, that time would heal her wounds. She wanted the reassurance of the woman who had held her hand and lied to her face. The phone continued to buzz, vibrating across the textured fabric of the bedspread, inching closer to my leg like an accusation. I looked up at Marcus. He had stopped moving. He was standing by the bed, looking down at the phone. He saw the photo. He saw the name. For a second, the mask slipped. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition? Guilt? A memory of the girl who had looked at him with genuine adoration? It was a crack in the armor, a moment where the reality of what we were doing threatened to intrude on our transaction. He looked at me, waiting to see what I would do. This was the test. If I answered, if I chose the role of the mother, the spell would break. The ugliness of our arrangement would be exposed by the innocence of her voice on the other end of the line. The room felt suddenly cold, the sound of the rain amplifying the silence between us. My hand hovered over the phone. I could picture her face, stained with tears. I could hear her voice in my head, asking me why it hurt so much. A normal mother would have felt a crushing wave of shame. A normal mother would have snatched the phone up, desperate to soothe her child. But I wasn't a normal mother anymore. I had excised that part of myself the night I walked into the kitchen. I looked at the smiling face of my daughter on the screen, and I felt a profound, icy detachment. She was a complication. She was a reminder of a world that demanded I be selfless, and right now, in this motel room, I wanted to be anything but. To answer the phone was to admit that she mattered more than my own pleasure. And the terrifying truth was, in this moment, she didn't. With a movement that was smooth and practiced, I reached out and swiped my finger across the screen. I pressed the red icon. The buzzing stopped instantly. The light on the screen died, plunging the room back into its sordid, comfortable twilight. I had sent the call to voicemail. I had silenced my daughter's cry for help so that I wouldn't have to interrupt my afternoon. The finality of the action hung in the air. I had chosen. I had chosen the paid lover over the heartbroken child. I had chosen the darkness over the light. I placed the phone face down on the mattress, burying her image against the cheap polyester, extinguishing the last beacon of conscience. I turned back to Marcus. He was watching me with a new expression now. The flicker of guilt was gone, replaced by a dark, intense fascination. He had seen me make the choice. He had seen the ruthlessness in my eyes, and instead of being repulsed, he looked aroused. He understood now that there were no limits to what I would do, no lines I wouldn't cross. We were bound together not just by the sex or the money, but by this shared secret, this mutual betrayal of the girl who loved us both. We were partners in crime, and the crime was the murder of innocence. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a perverse magnetism. He took a step closer, invading my personal space, his heat radiating towards me. "You are cold," he murmured, but it wasn't an accusation. It was a compliment. It was an acknowledgement that I was made of the same steel as him. He reached out, his hand large and warm, and brushed his knuckles against my cheek. The touch sent a shockwave through me, erasing the memory of the phone call, erasing the guilt, erasing everything but the pounding of my own blood. I leaned into his touch, closing my eyes, surrendering to the abyss I had willingly jumped into. I forgot about the rain drumming against the window. I forgot about the peeling wallpaper and the smell of smoke. Most of all, I forgot about the girl crying in her dorm room. I looked up at him, at the man I had bought and paid for, and I saw my own reflection in his dark eyes. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly not from fear, but from anticipation, and took hold of the damp towel around his waist. We had a deal to conclude. The money was on the table, the betrayal was complete, and as I pulled him down towards me, I realized that this was the only honest thing left in my life.